Why is there such a huge gap in the history of one of the world's most influential figures? In records considered sacred by billions of people, there is a disconcerting interval. The young man described as a prodigy at the age of 12 disappears completely from the pages for almost 2 decades. No details, no clues, no trace of what he experienced between adolescence and adulthood. Then, suddenly, he resurfaces with a spiritual authority that challenges the greatest masters of his time. This seemingly neglected void is one of the most enigmatic aspects of the Christian tradition. But absence is not the only mystery. What causes disquiet is the precision of silence. There is not even a reference to what would have been experienced at that time. The question that few dare to ask directly is, why remain so silent? In human history, gaps abound. Lost documents, destroyed libraries, buried civilizations. But when it comes to someone whose words shaped centuries of thought, ethics, and faith, the absence does not seem to be a simple fluke of time. During the years that shape identity, character, and worldview, the trace of the one who would later be followed as a spiritual master disappears completely. It's as if a biography was purposely written with pages torn out at the most decisive part of its formation. And this raises an inevitable suspicion. What was there that couldn't be told? The Gospels that have survived to this day do not ignore the topic due to a lack of sources. They skip this phase with an abrupt, almost calculated cut. They report his birth, then the episode in which, as a child, he demonstrates wisdom in front of elders, and then they jump directly to his baptism and the beginning of his ministry when he was already a grown man. The space between these 2 points is not small. It corresponds to most of his life before becoming a public figure. This leap, in itself, would be enough to arouse the curiosity of any historian. But the lack of institutional interest in rescuing this gap has always been even more revealing than the gap itself. Over the centuries, alternative documents have been found. Some were discarded because they were not aligned with the doctrinal criteria established by dominant ecclesiastical groups. Others simply disappeared. There are isolated mentions in texts of different origins that speak of a young master coming from the West, of a light-skinned man who taught about compassion, unity, and detachment very far from the region where he was born. The reports do not coincide in everything, but they converge on a central point. While the official records are silent, other paths suggest that that lost period was, in fact, full of intense learning, transformative encounters, and a profound spiritual journey. This type of narrative never found space in documents recognized as official. The structures that formed around the name of Jesus were interested in something else, consolidating a doctrine, establishing limits, and controlling interpretations. Anything that might dilute the uniqueness of the central figure, especially any idea that he had learned from other traditions or masters, needed to be removed. If there were records to suggest that his wisdom was built on experiences in distant cultures, this would weaken the idea of exclusive revelation, of an absolutely autonomous origin. Contrary to what one might imagine, the world of the first century was more connected than many assume. Trade routes, philosophical exchanges, and migrations created bridges between regions that, at first glance, would seem isolated. A person who grew up in a family with deep spiritual traditions, with access to urban centers and Jewish networks spread across the world, could cross deserts and mountains, learn languages, listen to teachers, and absorb diverse knowledge. The means were available, the weather too. What was missing, perhaps, was the subsequent interest in preserving this information. When someone suddenly appears at the age of 30 and speaks in such depth about topics that far exceed the common knowledge of their culture, the natural question would be, where have they been? How could anyone achieve such understanding without having been deeply transformed first? This question, instead of being encouraged, was forgotten. In its place, an image of isolated purity, of spontaneous wisdom, of knowledge that emerged without contact with the world was constructed. But this construction has cracks, and in the cracks, clues, connections, and echoes of untold stories emerge. If you like to delve into little explored topics with depth and clarity, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. This way, you can follow each new investigation that brings to light what many prefer to keep hidden. The clues are scattered. In ancient texts, in traditions preserved on the margins, in ruins of civilizations that maintained sophisticated spiritual centers. They also lie in the similarities between teachings that emerged from distant regions but share the same essence: compassion, non-violence, conscious presence, and detachment. When these ideas appear so clearly in someone who would have lived isolated in a Galilean village, the hypothesis of wider contact is not only possible, but necessary. Why does this topic bother you so much? Perhaps because, by accepting that there was a learning process outside traditional boundaries, we are led to reconsider what we understand by revelation, authority, and spiritual truth. What is suggested here is not an attack on faith, but a broadening of its perspective. Recognizing that the path of someone like Jesus may have passed through Eastern traditions, mystery schools, and intercultural experiences does not make it any lesser. On the contrary, it reveals the depth of his search, the humility of his listening, and the universality of his message. This is not just a forgotten biographical detail. It is the key to understanding why his words resonate so deeply in such diverse hearts, across centuries and borders. When investigating silence, what you find is not absence. It is the possibility of reconstructing, with more truth, the trajectory of a man who sought the light wherever it was and brought it back to illuminate the world. The silence that surrounds the unknown years of Jesus' youth cannot be understood in isolation. It needs to be analyzed within a larger context, where strategic decisions shaped what we know as Christianity today. The absence of records in the official Gospels is not just a result of the scarcity of documents at the time. There is solid evidence that part of this void was created intentionally within a specific historical process in which certain versions of Jesus' life were accepted, while others were discarded, erased, or labeled as heresy. The structuring of the canonical Gospels occurred at a time of deep ideological and theological disputes. During the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death, there were different Christian currents with different interpretations of who he was, what he taught, and how his trajectory should be understood. Gospels considered apocryphal today circulated freely among Christian communities spread across the Near East, North Africa, Asia Minor, and parts of Europe. Among these texts were reports that filled the missing years with passages from childhood, youth, and, mainly, spiritual journeys beyond the borders of Judea. These writings were read, taught, and valued by groups that did not see themselves as heretical. On the contrary, they believed they were preserving legitimate traditions transmitted by direct disciples or communities close to Jesus. What changed this scenario was the political consolidation of Christianity within the Roman Empire. When, at the beginning of the 4th century, the Christian religion went from being persecuted to favored by imperial power, a decisive movement towards doctrinal standardization began. The main milestone of this transformation occurred in the year 325, at the council held in the city of Nicaea. Convened by Emperor Constantine, the event brought together bishops from various regions to define the fundamental principles of the Christian faith. Although the stated aim was to end internal divisions, the council also functioned as a kind of historical triage. Among the issues discussed was the definition of which Gospels would be considered legitimate. Many texts that had been circulating until then began to be progressively eliminated. What did not fit into the project of theological unity was simply ignored or condemned. This process was neither technical nor neutral. The choice of official Gospels was not just based on authenticity or proximity to the facts. There were political, theological, and strategic criteria. Texts that presented Jesus as someone who sought wisdom outside the Jewish tradition, or that showed him connected to other spiritual currents were the first to be rejected. A master who had learned from Egyptian schools or from monks from the East did not serve the purpose of creating an exclusive doctrine centered on a unique revelation and inaccessible to other traditions. The final version of the story needed to be clear and without loopholes. Jesus should represent the supreme and definitive manifestation of divinity, whose spiritual authority would not have been influenced by any external source. This required erasing any possibility of prior learning, especially if that learning came from non-Jewish sources. The years between childhood and the beginning of public life were therefore an obstacle. It was more convenient for them to remain blank than to run the risk of admitting influences that could relativize their singularity. The nascent church, now associated with the state, had the means and power to consolidate this version. During the following centuries, several texts considered dissident were banned, copyists were instructed not to reproduce them, and monks responsible for preserving the manuscripts erased or destroyed entire passages. Most writings that contain divergent elements have completely disappeared. In some cases, only indirect quotations by later authors have survived. This systematic filtering effort resulted in a collection of documents that came to be treated as definitive. The Bible, as we know it today, was not born from an instantaneous revelation, but from a long negotiation between spiritual and political interests. It was assembled over centuries, with deliberate exclusions, selective inclusions, and repeated additions. And in this process, the so-called lost years were, little by little, buried under the weight of orthodoxy. If this message is making sense to you so far, write Amen in the comments. It's a simple way to show that you are connected with what is being revealed. But the echoes of these stories have not completely died down. Surviving records, archaeological discoveries, and testimonies preserved by parallel traditions continue to point to the possibility of a youth lived far from Galilee, between encounters with masters from other cultures and learning that did not fit into the molds established later. The gap in the Gospels is not just an informational void. It is a testament to the strength with which they tried to control the narrative. The suppression of these details compromises not only the historical portrait of Jesus, but also the understanding of his message. By removing the complete context of its formation, the image was created of a being that appears ready, complete, and without process. But every master is, first of all, a disciple. All true wisdom is built over time, through experiences, dialogues, and experiences. Erasing this journey is erasing part of the humanity of the one who taught so deeply about the heart, the spirit, and inner transformation. When you carefully observe what was kept and what was excluded, you can see a clear attempt to shape the figure of Jesus so that it would meet the demands of an institution that needed to assert itself as the only mediator between the divine and men. This decision cost the Christian tradition the loss of an essential part of its memory, precisely the one that perhaps explained in a broader way the universality of its message. The absence of official records about Jesus' formative years contrasts with signs preserved in lesser-known traditions, many of them located outside Jewish territory. Among the accounts that have survived outside canonical circles, there are references to a man from the West called Issa, who would have lived in eastern regions, such as India and Tibet, between the ages of 13 and 29. These records, found in Himalayan monasteries and passed down orally for generations, describe a period of learning among sages and monks, in which this foreign master would have studied meditation, spiritual ethics, and healing practices. Issa's name appears for the first time in an account published at the end of the 19th century by the Russian Nicholas Notovich, who claims to have found manuscripts in the monastery of Hemis in northern India. Although his testimony was received with suspicion, other scholars claim to have read similar documents later. The content spoke of a righteous man coming from the West who studied the teachings of Buddha, knew the Vedas, and practiced the principles of non-violence before returning to his homeland. Although the authenticity of the documents is a matter of debate, there are elements that support the hypothesis of a spiritual journey through Eastern territories. One of them is the strong affinity between the teachings of Jesus and fundamental concepts of traditions such as Buddhism and Hinduism. The idea that the kingdom is within the self, not outside it, is reminiscent of the teachings of the Upanishads, which talk about the divine dwelling within each person. The very use of the expression "Son of Man," common in the Gospels, also appears in Aramaic translations of Buddhist texts from ancient Bactria, a region that was home to Jewish communities and spiritual centers. Other clues are in the way Jesus conducted his practices. His retreats in isolated places, healing through touch, and emphasis on faith as an instrument of transformation coincide with common approaches in Eastern systems such as Ayurveda and Taoism. The spirituality he transmitted valued direct experience, self-knowledge, and inner silence, aspects little present in Judaism at the time, but central to Eastern traditions. The connection between these worlds was viable. During the 1st century, trade routes linked the Mediterranean to South Asia. The so-called Silk Road allowed the transit of merchants, ideas, and customs between Rome, Persia, India, and China. In cities like Alexandria, where there was a large Jewish community, there was an intense exchange of knowledge between Egyptians, Greeks, and Orientals. This created an ideal environment for spiritual seekers to roam in search of knowledge. The hypothesis that Jesus traveled along these routes, encountering different schools and traditions, not only gains historical meaning, but also offers a key to understanding the breadth of his message. The wisdom he taught seemed not to be limited to a single people, but touched on universal principles that crossed borders. The silence of the Gospels in this context seems less like a casual absence and more like a choice, leaving out everything that could reveal that Jesus' path was also a journey of discovery through many territories of the soul and the earth. The parallels between the teachings left by Jesus and the spiritual traditions of the East are not limited to generic similarities. They reveal a profound convergence of principles, symbols, and methods that, although adapted to different contexts, express an essentially shared spiritual vision. The origin of this affinity cannot be explained simply by coincidence. When distinct teachings converge with such precision, it is necessary to investigate whether there was real contact between this knowledge. Among the central elements that bring Jesus closer to Eastern traditions is the idea of inner transformation as a path to spiritual fulfillment. When he states that the kingdom is within each person, he breaks with the notion of salvation based only on external obedience and comes closer to the concept of enlightenment present in schools such as Buddhism and Vedanta. In the Upanishads, for example, we find the notion that the human being contains within himself the spark of the divine, and that the true path is the one that leads to the recognition of the unity between the self and the ultimate reality. This idea also appears in Jesus' speeches when he highlights that the pure in heart will see God, or that whoever has seen me has seen the Father, revealing an integrated perception between consciousness, divinity, and presence. Another point of contact is the way he approached suffering and ethical conduct. His guidance to love enemies, not return evil for evil, and turn the other cheek speaks to the Buddhist principle of active compassion and non-attachment to impulsive reactions. In the Dhammapada, a classic work attributed to Buddha, there are verses that state that hatred does not end with more hatred, but with love, and that the true wise man is the one who does not respond to insult with spite. This type of stance, taught by Jesus in the midst of religious tension and political occupation, points to a type of wisdom that transcends borders and aligns with traditions much older than Christianity. The way Jesus taught also deserves attention. The use of parables, short stories with multiple levels of meaning, finds parallels in the pedagogical method used in Zen Buddhism, where masters present parables and dilemmas that defy common logic, forcing the disciple to go beyond reason and delve into a direct, experiential understanding. Many of these narratives function as instruments of awakening, deconstructing certainties to make room for the intuitive perception of reality. The practice of silence, so valued in the Gospels when Jesus retreats to deserted places, also echoes in Eastern traditions as a means of purifying the mind. Voluntary silence, distancing from the crowd, and the search for solitude are constant hallmarks in the lives of both Buddhist monks and Hindu yogis. In these traditions, recollection is more than rest. It is an essential tool for accessing more subtle levels of consciousness. The healings performed by Jesus reflect an integrated vision between body, spirit, and energy, something widely developed in Eastern traditional medicine practices. In passages from the Gospels, he lays hands, restores health, and highlights the importance of the faith of those who receive it. This emphasis on inner power as a decisive element in healing is compatible with the teachings of prana in the Indian tradition and qi in Chinese philosophy, both understood as vital forces that circulate and sustain life and can be balanced or blocked depending on the state of the mind and heart. In the field of symbolic language, Jesus' instructions on vigilance, detachment, and attention to the present moment also reflect principles of mindfulness, known in Buddhism as hours. The proposal to live without clinging to the past or worrying about the future and to trust fully in divine providence is equivalent to the Tao's teaching on the fluidity of life and the need to act in harmony with the natural flow of things, without resistance. Even the non-dualist stance that Jesus adopts in many moments is close to the way Eastern masters understand reality. When he challenges the rigidity of the law in the name of the spirit of love, when he refuses the dichotomy between the pure and the impure, or when he asserts that the last will be first, he is revealing a vision that transcends opposites and points to the reconciliation of opposites, a characteristic trait of traditions such as Taoism, where light and shadow coexist as inseparable parts of the totality. These parallels do not detract from the originality of Jesus' teachings, but they suggest that his wisdom may have been influenced, in part, by older traditions with which he had contact or affinity. This possibility broadens the understanding of his historical role, showing that, instead of being an isolated master within a single culture, he may have been a link between different spiritual paths, translating to his people what he had experienced in other lands. By recognizing these connections, space is opened for a deeper look at its message, not as the property of a specific religion, but as an expression of a truth shared by different peoples and times. If Jesus' teachings reveal such clear affinities with spiritual traditions from different cultures, the decision to erase any trace of these influences was not just editorial. It represented a strategic choice with profound impacts on the formation of Western religious thought. By suppressing records that linked Jesus to external sources, those responsible for consolidating Christianity shaped a version of his figure centered on exclusivity, on an absolute authority unrelated to any other tradition. This construction did not happen spontaneously. As the Christian faith approached the power structures of the Roman Empire, it became necessary to present a solid, uniform, and indisputable doctrine. A teaching that suggested dialogue with other philosophies or that pointed to a journey of learning beyond Jewish borders would weaken the argument for revealed singularity. To establish a religious system that could expand centrally, it was necessary to create an indisputable origin, and to do this, eliminating nuances and complexities became part of the process. The exclusivity attributed to the figure of Jesus allowed the emerging church to define itself as the only mediator between humanity and the divine. This position not only consolidated spiritual authority, but also legitimized political and social influence. Anything that threatened this foundation, alternative texts, divergent traditions, reports of contact with Eastern cultures, came to be considered dangerous. Books were discarded, teachers were discredited, and versions of Jesus' life that did not fit into official doctrine disappeared from copies preserved by dominant religious centers. The erasure of these elements limited the field of vision of the faithful themselves. By presenting Jesus as someone who was born ready-made, without process, without searching, without coexistence with other schools of wisdom, the message transmitted over the centuries was that the truth is contained only in institutionalized revelation. This reduced the transformative potential of his trajectory to a fixed, untouchable model, far from real human experience. Instead of an accessible path, an idealized figure was constructed, separated from other traditions and removed from the spiritual plurality of the ancient world. The consequences of this exclusivity go beyond religion. They influenced the way the West came to view spiritual knowledge. The fragmentation between the Christian sacred and other paths generated distances, prejudices, and conflicts. What could have been recognized as part of universal wisdom was transformed into a rigid doctrine, a closed religious identity, incapable of dialoguing with other expressions of faith. By hiding Jesus' previous steps, the chance to show his humanity and process was also lost. Someone who walked, learned, evolved, and integrated different voices into his own message. When we observe how history was shaped, not only by the hands of those who wrote it, but also by those who decided what should remain and what should be silenced, we realize that Jesus' trajectory was perhaps broader than imagined, and richer. The decision to construct a narrative centered on exclusivity not only erased the experiences he may have had outside of Judea, but also obscured the path that led him to become the master who challenged structures, broke traditions, and touched the human essence with words that spanned centuries. Resuming these possibilities is not an exercise in baseless speculation. It is an attempt to reopen a space that was artificially closed, to recognize that spirituality can be the result of encounters, crossings, and attentive listening. The image of a Jesus who sought wisdom from different sources, who walked through distant territories and absorbed the deepest aspects of each tradition, does not weaken his message. On the contrary, it expands its power, showing that spiritual truth does not belong to a single people, nor can it be imprisoned by institutions. By understanding that his teachings echo voices from the East, that his actions dialogue with ancient practices, and that his language incorporates symbols present in different cultures, the possibility of a more generous reading of faith opens up, a reading that does not require the denial of the other, but invites the recognition of what is common between different paths. A faith that does not impose barriers, but builds bridges. The exclusivity taught for centuries may have offered security, but it came at the cost of freedom. It costs access to a more integrated, more human understanding, closer to the experience of transformation itself. Recovering the lost fragments of Jesus' youth is also recovering the perception that wisdom is not born ready-made. It is the result of search, openness, and humility to learn from what is unknown. In a world marked by divisions, the story of a man who crossed borders, not just physical but cultural and spiritual, has a lot to teach. The coherence between what he lived and what he taught may be precisely in the way he knew how to welcome what came from outside and transform it into something new, authentic, and accessible to his people. This attitude, more than any miracle, is perhaps his greatest legacy, the ability to recognize the light in different paths without losing one's own direction. There is something deeply revealing in the idea that the missing years of his biography were lived not in silence, but in learning. That the void left in the official texts does not mean absence, but concealment. And that the reunion with these lost fragments can give contemporary spirituality a more complete, more plural, and more true dimension. What is proposed, therefore, is not to replace one version with another, nor to exchange old certainties for new definitive answers. The invitation is different, to allow the mystery to inspire the search, for silence to awaken listening, and for doubt to transform into openness. Because if there is something that the great masters teach, it is that the truth is not imposed. It reveals itself little by little to those who walk with attention and courage. At the end of this journey, one question remains. What if Jesus' greatness is not just in what he taught, but in what he chose to live before he started teaching. The answer, perhaps, does not lie in a single book nor in an immutable dogma, but in the recognition that the deepest spirituality is that which is born from the encounter between worlds, and that the paths taken in silence have as much to say as the words recorded out loud. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. This helps a lot to keep this work on the air. And take the opportunity to activate the bell, because in the next video, we will continue to delve deeper into topics that are worth your attention. See you there.